All right. Good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you at the end of the semester on a cold night on a Tuesday. So welcome to the Harvard Graduate School of Education. My name is Fernando Reimers, and I'm the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education at this school. And it is my privilege today to introduce and chair this panel in which we're going to discuss a collaborative curriculum design project among 50 teachers in multiple U.S. states. And if you give me a second, I need to get a clicker, which I hope is here waiting for me. It is. Thank you. Because this is the time when I click to the second slide. So we're going to hear from 3 of those teachers who participated in writing this book. And I hope by now you all have a copy of this curriculum so you can read their full bios in the book that should be in your hand. Monica Bryant, who's an elementary school counselor in Las Vegas, and who I'm glad made her flight and arrived here. We're going to hear from Michael Moraz, who's an elementary special education teacher in Northbridge, Massachusetts. And we're going to hear from Hannah Rogers, who's a middle school STEM teacher in Pelham, Alabama. And of course, we're going to hear from Kristen Shannon from the National Education Association Foundation, who's really been the soul of this collaboration, of this project. Now, this collaboration resulted in the book 12 Lessons to Open Classrooms and Minds to the World, which those of you who have received a copy thanks to the NEA Foundation. And those of you following on the live stream can download freely from Amazon this week. I want to recognize the NEA Foundation for their commitment to promoting teacher leadership as a way to strengthen public education, and for their vision to support teacher leaders in developing their capacity to educate global citizens. I'm delighted to recognize Dr. Robert Adams, where are you, who's here, who is with us tonight and who has led the Global Learning Fellows program with much skill and distinction. I also want to recognize NEA Foundation board member Kevin Anderson. And in a moment, I'm going to ask him to make a few remarks, who's the vice chair of the board of directors of the NEA Foundation, as well as senior vice president of national partnerships of EverFi. And I also want to recognize 2 other individuals not with us tonight, but whose support has been critical to this program. Sharon Gallagher, the chair of the board of the NEA Foundation, and Harriet Sanford, the president of the NEA Foundation. Kevin, could I call on you to say a few words?
Sure. Should I speak to me? Oh. Great. Well, thanks. It is an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to be here, and thank all of you for your attendance. And Professor Reimers, we cannot extend our thanks for your help and support. The work that we do is one for the ages. It cannot be ever known or seen to be of the ultimate importance that it is. What we do with the Global Fellowship Program and the travels and the experience that we give educators for the ultimate promise of keeping public education is just fantastic. I bring you greetings from Harriet Sanford, the current president and CEO, and all of the programs and the wonderful teachers of the affiliates all across the United States of America. And just want to continue to always say thank you for all of your support. We will continue to work hard to keep the faith, to keep the promise of education, and do all of the work that we can. And to Robert and all of the staff, thanks again so much. And Fernando, thanks again.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Now, this work would not have been possible without the hard work of the teachers, the Global Teacher Fellows, whose names are up here, most of whom I hope are watching the live stream, but a few of whom are here with us tonight. So why is this project important? It's important for several reasons, which are explained in the introduction of the book, but I'm going to quickly summarize them here. The underlying premise of this work is that one of the imperatives of schools is to provide students opportunities to develop capacities that empower them to identify and achieve their goals and to join others in advancing shared interests. Because the larger context in which schools operate is changing, the requirements for participation are changing as well. And as a result, schools must change in order to ensure that not only are students well taught, but that they are taught what matters. In a world that is increasingly interdependent, learning to think critically about global affairs increasingly matters. And students need to learn how local and global affairs are interdependent. They need to be able to identify, share interests, and to collaborate with others across national borders. Teachers have a central role to play in helping their students develop such global awareness and understanding. And to do this, they must lead in creating new curriculum and new pedagogies. And we're going to hear from some of them tonight about the process of creating such curriculum. And they must lead broader coalitions in support of public education's role, educating cosmopolitans at a time when public schools are under siege. The capacity of teachers as professionals to rise to the imperative of a relevant public education is augmented when they do this work with the support of professional networks. Such networks connect teachers with their peers and with other educators and experts who can support them in the work of empowering curriculum and pedagogy. And in doing this collaborative work, teachers also develop the essential leadership skills to exert the essential leadership that will sustain public education in the future. Now, this project is anchored in 5 key propositions, which you have here on this slide. So let me say a word about each one of those propositions. Start with the end in mind. You all remember the story Alice in Wonderland, right? Where she gets into this intersection, says, which way do I go, east or west? And the cat says, which way do you want to go? She says, well, I don't know, east or west, it's all the same. And then the cat replies, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And I think the relevance of that story to starting with the end in mind is that obviously any teacher who designs curriculum begins with the end of what kinds of learning outcomes they want their students to achieve, but not always with the further aim of what kind of a society do they hope their students will help build with those competencies that they gain. And that is what we have done in this project. Engage a very accomplished group of teachers in a conversation about a very ambitious vision of what would it take to build a world where everyone belongs and feels valued, where the human rights of every person are respected. What kinds of capacities should we help our students gain to make that world possible? So that's principle number 1. Essentially, any curriculum is built on 2 hypotheses. The hypothesis that if we teach A, students will learn B, and the second hypothesis that if students learn B, C will happen in the world. But it's not often the case that we make those hypotheses visible to others and that we test them publicly. We test them in the privacy of our own minds, but testing those hypotheses publicly is essential to build the kind of knowledge that can sustain a profession. And that's what a network such as this one can help do. Create a mechanism and support a process that makes it possible to formally test the hypothesis that if we teach A, students will learn B, and if they learn B, C will happen in the world. Second principle, leverage improvement networks to design curriculum. The second principle underlying the process that we followed is that the task of curriculum design, particularly when it involves domains which are new, is complex, and it's one that requires collaboration with others. And while we may cherish the ideal that each teacher should develop her own curriculum, the reality of how the work of teachers is constructed is that there is no time to do that work well. And hence the need for collaboration, hence the need for involving colleagues in doing this work together. So professional networks such as the one that produced this book to develop these resources have a distinct advantage as a way to produce collective intelligence. They can adapt dynamically to feedback that results from rapid cycles of experimentation, and they can augment the learning that results from similar cycles taking place in multiple settings. And we're going to hear today what 3 of these teachers are learning from implementing and testing this curriculum in their various schools. Third principle is learn by doing. A third principle illustrated by the approach we adopted in constituting this professional network is that professionals must necessarily experiment as a way to themselves gain new knowledge and capacities and to create new knowledge. It may appear paradoxical that we propose an approach that provides teachers a central role in crafting knowledge in domains that they themselves may need to become more proficient in. The reason to do this is because any curriculum is going to be only as effective as the use that teachers can make of it. And we need strong synergies between curriculum and teacher capacities in order to sustain effective teaching practice. And that means that new curriculum and new teacher capacities need to develop simultaneously. One helps the other. A very effective way to build new teacher capacities is to engage teachers in developing lessons, because this provides a performance of understanding which translates conceptual and abstract discussions into direct observable evidence of what is being understood and of potential knowledge gaps. I was going to say something about the epistemology of this process, but I think I'm going to spare you that and leave it for the Q&A. So the fourth principle is the power of a problem-based education. The capacities necessary to thrive in the 21st century are best gained engaging students with real problems, ambitious problems, difficult problems, and inviting students to try out solutions to those problems. Such problem and project-based education draws on the traditions of progressive education developed by John Dewey and are consistent with current knowledge about how to support deeper learning. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are an example of such grand, ambitious challenges. Number one, no poverty. What does it mean to build a world without poverty? Gender equality, Goal 5, and so on. And then lastly, the last principle illustrated by this work is the power of collaboration in diverse teams. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals will require unprecedented collaboration at all levels. If there is one skill that all learners will need to develop, is the skill to collaborate. And the reliance on the resources presented in this book on collaborative project-based methodologies is intended to help students develop such collaborative skills. But in order for teachers to teach their students to collaborate, they must themselves develop their own skills to collaborate professionally, and that's what we have tried to do. So to conclude, this one-year experience illustrates what I think are the principles of high-quality, powerful professional development. In the Global Education Innovation Initiative, a research and practice project that I lead, we have just published this book, and I'm going to take the opportunity to at least show a slide of the book. I don't have copies for each of you to give, which examines high-quality programs. And what they all do is very similar to what this program has tried to do. So let me now turn it over to Kristen Shannon for her to provide the context and background of this project within the NEA Foundation, and then we're going to hear from each of the teachers to describe to us, first of all, how they develop these lessons and how they engage their colleagues, and then to reflect on where they think this process is going to go in the future. Kristen.
Great. Thanks, Fernando. Can everyone hear me loud and clear on the live stream? They can't really wave at me or let me know, but I'm trusting that everyone can hear me this evening rather. I'm fresh on coffee. All of our panelists up here either arrived today, left work early, and I think it just shows the dedication and commitment to this work. So my task, and I think I have 5 minutes, is to really situate this book in a larger continuum of the Global Learning Fellowship. So I'll start by answering the question, what is the Global Learning Fellowship? It's fluid is what I'll say. So it started off in 2010 really as a field study experience for teacher leaders. And we took a group of about 15 U.S. educators from different states and really spent a week, and we partnered with EF Education First, just learning more about Chinese education, learning more about the culture. And that was in the summer. And what we found is in the fall following that field study, they were like, what's next? Once you're bought on for this work, how do you get others on board? How do you translate that into your practice? So that's really been the essential question of the fellowship. So we sat with that. We've convened several work groups, done a lot of, design thinking, and it's an iterative process is what I'll say. And that's what brought us to our partnership with Fernando. And they're now doing coursework. And I think the coursework kind of centers on these few questions. What is global competency? What does it look like in a classroom context? What does global competency look like, not just understanding yourself as an educator, but also as an individual, understanding your own biases, your own knowledge of the world, but also understanding that global education isn't just learning about other countries. It's a framework. And for the fellowship, we do a lot with the Asia Society framework, recognizing different perspectives, investigating the world. And I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals takes us to the part of taking action. And that's why I'm so pleased that we are using that as a framework now, because that was not always the case. So what does the fellowship look like? They take online modules, coursework, so on and so forth. You guys feel free to chime in. But really, as I said, it's centered on what is global competency? What does it look like in a classroom context? And once you're bought on for this work, and this is a new dimension to the work, advocacy. And so I think this book is seen as both process and product, because this is something tangible. You can show your administrator, hey, you know, I did a 3rd grade lesson plan on gender equity. This is something that we can engage with in rural Mississippi. This is something that we can engage with in Belmont, Massachusetts. It knows no kind of local context. I think when we look at it from a problem-solving standpoint, there's this old adage, if you want to solve a problem, make it bigger. So how do you make it bigger? You increase the network. So our fellows come from all over the country. We have Massachusetts on the stage. We have Alabama on the stage. We have Nevada on the stage. We have, you know, myself, Maryland on the stage. I'm not a teacher, but you have all this wealth of diversity, subject, content, knowledge. So the really true goal of the fellowship is leveraging those teacher leadership networks and putting tools in their hands created by them to lead that change.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much, Kristen. Monica, share with us, how did you engage with developing that? How did you engage your colleagues in your school doing that? Describe for us what this participation meant to you professionally.
So, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
With this professional development, what I found, first, I'm not a classroom teacher. I am an elementary school counselor. And so I was very excited to be engaged in this, because a lot of times I feel like I have fellow counselors who are like, well, this isn't something that's important to us. This is not work that we need to be doing. This is work that teachers should be doing. But really, it's the work of all of us. Because while I'm not in the classroom doing actual lessons, but the empathy pieces of it, the problem solving, the conflict resolution, those are things that apply to my position and things that I can be doing in my classroom as well. So when I came on board with this, I participated in the 3rd grade lesson that is in our book, and I was in a group with a music teacher and a teacher leader. And we kind of laughed when we got placed together, because we were like, well, none of us teach in the typical capacity, you know? I'm like, here's a counselor, here's a music teacher, here's a teacher leader. Like, none of us have our own set of kids, so how are we going to make this work? And so we were developing our lesson plan, and I do have a teaching background. I taught my first 5 years. And so we all had these teaching backgrounds, and we came up with this lesson. And we were like, okay, now we got to teach it. So then we're like, okay, we're a music teacher, we're a school counselor, we're a teacher leader. How are we going to find some kids, right? So I was like, well, I'll hijack a classroom. It's okay, you know. And so I was like, well, I have friends in the 3rd grade classrooms. Like, somebody will let me teach. And one of the other teachers were like, well, you know, I'll find one of my mentors who I'm teaching, and we'll figure out how to teach the lesson. Well, my administrator became very unsupportive. And so that's a huge piece of it. You got to make sure that somebody is on board with the work that you're trying to do. Because that makes your life a whole lot easier. And so then I wasn't able to teach the lesson, but we ended up getting our lesson taught from our teacher mentor and coming back and finding that it was very successful. So we were able to still make tweaks to what we knew. We were able to get it out there. And what I do now is I collaborate. I'm at a brand new school, very supportive administrator. And so what I do now is I hijack classrooms all the time. And I'm like, hey, this is something that I want to do. There's this website, empatico.org. It's amazing. Can I find a classroom who's willing to partner with me so that I can do some of this work? And my administrator's like, find whoever you want to. And I've got 5 teachers on board who want to do this work with me. So even though I don't have my own set of kids, I find that I collaborate with other classroom teachers so that we can still get the work out there. And so I've brought this book to my administrator. I'm like, hey, we should really check this out. The teachers at my school are very receptive. So they're like, oh, let me look and see how I can fit this in. Teachers are doing empatico.org now, because that was something that I put out there to my school. And so I find that with doing this work, and the more you know, the more you can grow. And I also have been sharing this with other counselors, because I'm like, it's on us too. So a lot of it is the empathy pieces, and we can be teaching the empathy. And now I used to just teach empathy in certain grade levels because I like to build, but now every grade level is getting empathy lessons, because it starts and we can build and we can talk about different things. And so I think it's just taking what we've learned and being able to apply it no matter what capacity that we are in the education field, whether we're special ed, we're gate teachers, we're elementary, we're middle school, we're high school. It's work that all of us can be doing in a variety of ways.
Thank you, Monica. Hannah, tell us about your engagement with this project from Alabama.
So I'm going to go back to when I got my email from Kristen when I
Which one?
was accepted. The first one. I missed them, by the way. I missed them.
She sent a lot of emails.
Yes. The very first one when we were accepted. And I was like, I'll never forget the moment. My kids, I teach science. My kids were taking a test. And so I'm going to check my email while they're taking the test. And there's Kristen's congratulatory email. I'm like, I'm going to South Africa next year. And it just, and so truth be told, in the beginning, it was all about the trip. It was like, yeah, I'm going to South Africa, people. But what I didn't know then was that in the end, I would come back from South Africa after a full year of professional development about global education, just inspired and empowered. I have been teaching for 21 years, and after a while, it gets very routine, 21 years. And so doing this program has been really empowering and inspiring. Like, I have always talked about world issues in my classroom and talked about the world. I never had like a label for it. And so global education, global competency, that's it. That's what I've been doing. And so I remember the very first webinar. I was like, I'm so excited about this webinar. This webinar is like awesome. I can't wait. And so I was so excited about it. And then 4 or 5 webinars after that, I had just learned so much. And then going to DC, of course, and meeting everybody, that was so inspiring. And working on this book. At first, my group, we came up with a 7th grade lesson. And at first, we were quiet. Like, it needed, like the ice needed to be broken or something. Like, nobody was saying anything. Okay, we have to come up with a 7th grade lesson. Okay. And so finally, when somebody said something, that very first idea, then the idea started flowing. And I have taught our lesson in my school. Our lesson is all about perspective and accepting diverse perspectives. The students absolutely loved it. It's about, they had to look at optical illusions, and then they had to explain to one another what they see, and accepting each other's perspective. Like, I see this. No, I see this. And then so that was a wonderful experience for them. And I've taught Monica's lesson. I taught her lesson last Friday. I was like, hey kids, we're going to do this lesson. So your lesson was about water. And then we looked at the UNICEF water map, and we looked at the 3 stories about where students, where they got their water. And so I taught it in my ESL class, and it brought about some memories for them about their family. I have one student from Guatemala, and he's like, in Guatemala, we have to get our water from the well. Actually, he said the hole, but I was like, is it a well? And so and so that was really a powerful conversation within the class. So I thought that was great. They want to talk about it again. They want to keep looking at that water map, and so that we can find out about how people get water. And then I said, here in Pelham, it's so easy. You just go to the tap, and there it is. But some people, it's not that easy. And so that was really a powerful exposure about the world to them. And of course, it also brought about countries, different places. So that was wonderful. And so if I were to explain this whole experience for me, it's empowering, it's inspiring, it's meeting, it's being back here again. And it's so happy just to know that I have 49 friends in the United States. So, and the kids think that that's just wonderful.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Michael, share your perspective.
Well, similar to the other two, when I got accepted to the program, I thought it was really exciting, and it was really, at first, really all about I'm going to South Africa. Like, this is absolutely amazing. And I'm really grateful that I've done a lot of traveling, but I've never been to South Africa. So it really was all about that at first. But I'm also a first grade teacher in a very small town in Massachusetts, and we have very limited resources. And it was amazing for me to go to Washington, D.C. It was actually intimidating at first. I was very nervous at first. And running into people, and, they're teachers of the year for their states. They're doing teachers of the year for their towns, doing really big things. And now all I kept on saying was, I'm really just a first grade teacher.
You say you teach the little guys.
Yeah, I teach the little guys. That's what I do. But I was really lucky to end up with 2 first grade teachers. One general ed teacher and another one who did first, second grade, gifted and talented. And our challenge really was, how can we do global education in a way that is developmentally appropriate for 6 and 7-year-olds?
Right.
You know, that was a really big challenge for us at first, with my initial understanding of what global education is. But as we move forward with broadening and deepening our understanding of what that is, we actually realized a lot of the work that we do every day is actually global education, kind of like what Monica said. My whole social emotional learning program, where I'm talking about kids being, you know, aware of their feelings, aware of other people's feelings, problem solving, dealing with bullying, dealing with and also being assertive, and things like that are all parts of a global learning piece. So a lot of the work that we do. So I was a little bit less intimidated, and we were able to actually end up develop a plan that had to do really with a global spin on the classic country mouse, city mouse lesson that a lot of teachers do. Just that they weren't mice, they were people, and that they lived in South Africa. So that's what we ended up doing. And it really was a powerful lesson. All 3 of us taught it. It went very differently for all 3 of us. And what the kids had to do is we did a read aloud from a perspective of a boy who lived in Cape Town, a more urban environment, and then another story about a student that lived in the Transkei, where Nelson Mandela is from, a very rural environment. And the kids had to do a Venn diagram where we compared and contrasted the experiences between the 2 books. And then also we could expand it into having kiddos talk about how they are similar and different to those experiences. And really our big point, our kind of big issue that we wanted to tackle with this lesson is first graders tend to not have a lot of exposure to places like Africa, especially South Africa. Their really only exposure may be Lion King, you know, the Kraft brothers on PBS. So when they think about Africa, they have very kind of stereotypical thinking about those places. So what we wanted to do was counter those stereotypical thinking that 2 people can live in the same place and have very different experiences. Just like where we live, 2 people can have very different experiences. So to kind of counter that stereotypes. So it ended up being a really good lesson. So we enjoyed it, and it was really a wonderful experience and continues to be a wonderful experience.
My entire school taught my lesson, I forgot to say.
The entire school? All the grades?
All grades. Our school is a Leader in Me school, and it's a program. Are you a Leader in Me school?
I'm not, but I'm familiar with the program.
Okay, it's a program that embraces the 7 habits of highly effective people, and so I was in charge. I was part of a group that proposed a lesson for habit number 4, which is think win-win. And I said, you know, I got a perfect lesson for this. And so I brought up our lesson about perspective, because in order to have a win-win situation, you have to accept another person's perspective.
Exactly.
So my entire school taught this lesson, and the response was wonderful.
That's great.
But I think that's the beauty of it, because, you know, with all of our lessons, we looked, and we've talked about this before a little bit, where we were like, the thing that we would change if we could do this again, one of the things is, you know, we did a book and we were like, this is a kindergarten lesson, this is a first grade lesson, this is a second grade lesson, and so on. But we were like, really, they're not. You know what I mean? Because you can take that third grade lesson and tweak it to 7th grade. You can take that 7th grade lesson and figure out how to make it work for your younger kids or your older kids. So it's really about seeing what you can pull from it and what you can do with it to meet the needs of the community that
you wrote it as a 3rd grade lesson, but I teach 6th grade, so and it fits wonderfully.
Right.
And my principal actually is open, so we continue to be a Leader in Me school next year, and he's open to adopting the book for next year's lessons.
That's great.
Wonderful.
So maybe before we open it up for questions and comments, what are you going to do with these resources? You now have 49 new friends and a bunch of books that you wrote. What are your plans going forward?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities, because there are a lot of movers and shakers in the group, in the current group and in the past group. So I think our school is doing an international art exchange. the current Rhode Island Global Learning Fellow. I'm doing a book donation service project with the Philippines that she's been doing for many years. We're doing Empatico. We've been paired with a school in Mississippi, so we'll be doing that. And also with the experience in South Africa, I'm rewriting our mammal unit that we do at the end of the year. And we traditionally do mammals of New England, but I'm also going to be doing mammals of South Africa with lots of safari photos and videos. And I think the kids are just going to go nuts about that.
For sure.
Yeah. So those are the kind of the big projects. But there's also like the everyday things where even before I entered the program, I often would break out a map whenever I would teach a book, or especially if it had a particular setting, so kids would often know where they happen. So I think we're just going to continue that kind of work. So build their content.
Last year, I connected via Google Hangouts with so many fellows. The kids love that. Just to see other students from other places and ask them questions. I'd like to continue that, to connect via Skype or...
That's great. How about you, Monica?
And right now I have up a Global Ed bulletin board that's interactive, so it's got for each of the sustainable goals. So I focus on one every couple of weeks and switch out, and students can take little sheets and things that they can do at home, and a couple have stopped by and we've kind of chatted because they're like, I don't necessarily understand, and so I explain it to them a little more, and it's in kid-friendly language, which was really, really hard in elementary school to try to find how you break down what does poverty really mean, that from kinders to fifth grade, something that they can really understand. I'm also partnering with my art teacher, so we are looking to build an after-school global ed after-school club. I was like, I'm lost for words. An after-school club, so we're going to be focusing on the sustainable goals and then figuring out how we can attach an art piece to them. So whether we're going to send it overseas or we're going to have a display at our school, we're still working out the kinks of that. But I think for all of us, it's been great because we have this Facebook group and we're all been posting all of these wonderful ideas that people are doing, and then we're kind of stealing everybody else's ideas too.
Right.
Because
it's collaborating.
It is.
Collaboration.
We're collaborating.
That's not stealing.
And so, I mean, I'm okay. But it's, you know what I mean? And so we're taking ideas, or somebody will post something and then we're like, oh, that's great. I wonder if I can tweak that to fit the needs of my students here. And we're like, can you tell me more about that? Can you keep us updated with how you're doing it? Because I mean, honestly, that's a lot of what we do anyways when we're looking for lessons, right? We're taking what somebody else has done and we're trying to tweak it to fit the needs of our students. And we have some of our fellow fellows sitting here with us. And so everybody's been putting out these amazing ideas of things that they're doing. And some stuff I hadn't even like crossed my mind to do. I was just like, you're doing that? That's amazing. Like, how can I do that too? And we've been so closely tied with empatico.org now. Ooh, is that me? Oh. And all of us are, we're looking to do more with empatico.org. So like I said, I've got a teacher that I'm working with closely, and we're paired with a school in West Virginia, and my principal's on board. And so we're a one-to-one Chromebook school, but we're like, Chromebook screens are too small. We want to be able to see everybody. So he's bought us a webcam, and we're going to be like full on the smart board. So we're super excited, but we're going to do weather because Las Vegas, we don't get much, it's heat, and that's pretty much it, right? And so we
raining or not raining.
Exactly. And so we can't wait to pair with West Virginia because they were talking about we're about to get snow, and our kids are like, what's snow, And so pieces of that has been really exciting to see. And there's several other teachers, like I said, at my school who are on board, and they're signing up to do empatico.org. So I think it's doing a lot of it yourselves, but also getting it out there, because a lot of it does work well with what teachers are already doing in their classrooms, and a lot are probably already doing the work and just not calling it global
whatever
ed.
it is. Yes.
It's wonderful.
And I just want to build on something that Monica said, just contextualizing your question specific to the fellowship. The real challenge for us has been bridging that gap between what I like to call islands of excellence. So you're hearing from these different people who are isolated maybe in their school buildings, obviously coming from very different contexts, but oftentimes a lot of the teachers doing this work are the only one in their particular context. So what does it look like? I told you that the foundation has been supporting this fellowship work since 2010. So we have several cohorts of this geographic diversity that we need to put in communion with one another to kind of galvanize this movement. So you talk a lot about, resources or sharing, picking or stealing, collaborating, so on and so forth. But we need to bridge that gap and let people know, hey, there's a former Global Learning Fellow who's like 20 miles from you. It's a blessing that, a lot of the former fellows are here tonight that are local. So, and I think the second part of that challenge is lifting it up even beyond the fellowship. It's an honor for you guys to have been accepted to this, but there are so many millions of other teachers who may not ever have this experience. And I think that is why this book is such a wonderful resource, because this is something that codifies a year-long worth of learning, and it'll continue, but this is something that is public facing. And that's really been the challenge of the fellowship, is lifting the learnings, both as process and product, to just prove the value of this, that this work really does matter. And I think a lot of your comments, if I could kind of condense them, really shows that global education is not something else on the plate. It really is the plate itself. You guys are already doing this work, and it's just finding, how do I squeeze in South Africa to, a lesson plan about mammals? How do I squeeze in, sustainable energy, sustainable cities into a lesson for kindergartners? That really is a challenge for the foundation. Just looking forward with the fellowship.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Kristen. Why don't we open it up for you? We have 2 microphones on the hallways. I would ask you to queue behind the mics. And to make this less of a tennis or ping pong match, why don't we take 3 questions and then give our panelists an opportunity to address them. Charlotte, tell us who you are and try to end your question with a question mark.
Sure. I do that in class, Professor. My name's Charlotte. I'm one of the international education policy students. I spent the last 5 years working in Asia and noticed that a lot of the global education platforms that were really great were coming from the United States. But it was tough to then translate that into a non-US context. So I think this curriculum is incredibly valuable, and I'm wondering how people who are listening to it or get the book that are not based in the United States might be able to translate what's in this book to their classrooms.
That's a great question. Let me see if I have a couple of questions. I see Seth trying to get up to a microphone. And then I see Lucy. Are you trying to get out or not?
I'm just making way.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming and writing this.
Tell us who you are.
Oh, sure. My name's Seth Layton. I'm currently the executive director of Envoys. We're a global education organization that works primarily with schools on customized programs with a blended model of online courses and focused international and domestic travel. Former student of Dr. Emer's. I was really struck by your phrase that this was not just about the product of the book, but the process as well. And I began my career as a 5th grade teacher, and I was struck as thinking about lesson planning as something that you do every day. And I was curious if you could touch on how the process of lesson planning for these lessons was different than the work you do every day. What was similar and what made it special or different.
That's great. Do we have a third question? Well, if not, we can turn it over. Who would like to take any of the 2 questions or both of them?
So I think for me, when we were doing the lesson planning pieces of this, I had to focus on 2 lenses, so to speak. So I had to go back to my teaching role, because I'm like, we got to do a lesson that most people can do, right? But then I had to think about my counselor role and say, well, as a school counselor, what pieces of this can I do that I can actually bring back to my students and doing my own to stay in my role, so to speak. And so I think with the process for us, when I was working with my group, was really trying to figure out how it worked for us as in a teacher lens, like how we can get this out, but also what to stick in our roles as well, because I had a music teacher, I had a teacher leader, and then myself as a school counselor. And so it was a little bit different, because now we know, like the music teacher, for example, Emily, one of my fellows, and so she has already talked to us about how she's been incorporating in some South African music and things now into her music program, and she was teaching her students how to use different instruments and things like that. So I think it's being more intentional about the lesson planning. Like I think sometimes something Hannah said earlier was that we get in a a system, right? So like we have to lesson plan every day. So it's just this, all right, here's my objective. Here's what I want my kids to do, blah, blah. You know what I mean? And so it's being more intentional. Like, am I really looking at this from a global ed lens? What is that small thing that I can tag into my lesson? Am I pulling up a map before we read a book to say, here's where this story takes place? Am I being, so I think it's just being more intentional, like making sure that your global ed lens is on when you're doing your lesson plan. And I think as far as the book goes, to a little bit to your question over here, I think what's nice about it is that the sustainable goals were the focus when we were putting these lessons together. And so I think that those, because the UN did them, they are a little bit more worldly, so to speak. And so being able to have a set thing that everybody, like poverty is everywhere. You know what I mean? It's not just a United States issue, it's an issue everywhere, in some places more so than others. So I think because the focus was the sustainable goals, it is something that an Asian culture could be able to take a sustainable goal and use it in their country or an African country or whatever the case may be. And a few of us still have connections to the students and the things from South Africa. And so these are things that they can do as well in lessons, because there's still poverty, there's still gender issues, there's still water issues, there's still all of these issues that they're not just issues of America, they're issues of the world. And so I think with these lesson plans, they do translate a little bit more because the focus was those sustainable goals.
Thank you, Monica. Hannah, do you have any thoughts on the questions?
In responding to Seth's question, I was trying to think about what is different about planning and then plan. I teach 6th grade, so it's very collaborative, and so it was something that felt natural when we thought of the lesson. But as you said, there's a focus, and we needed to come up with a lesson that is going to exemplify global education. And so when we came up with perspective, we're like, yeah, this is a really good lesson for everyone. And so I think that, yeah, in thinking about the answer to your question, yeah, I can see why that would be would be an issue. And so I'm not sure, because perspective is different in Asia. Like you teach in Asia, so that's accepted differently in Asia. So yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, it's hard to make it into a lesson that would fit.
That's fine. Michael.
But actually, jumping off of what you said, I think that if you look not necessarily at the lessons that we developed, but actually the process that we went through with the sustainability goals being your end process and actually using the templates and the process, I think that you could come to your own end point. Because we are certainly not the only group that has done this. Like Professor Fernandez, Reimers, has done this before, so there are other examples of these kinds of lessons out there, and previous Global Learning Fellows have done them as well. So if you just kind of take the process and work through that process in a way that's meaningful for the community that you live in, and the culture that it happens, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. But not only just to do them, but to share them with other people in your country, but also around the world. So we can kind of have this ongoing dialogue of what's appropriate there, what's appropriate here, why isn't it appropriate here? And I think that dialogue is really important for teachers to have internationally if we are really going to work together on the UN sustainability goals. So I think, I don't know, does that answer your question? Yeah. And I think the whole planning process was really refreshing, because I would say about 99% of my planning is standard-based. You know, if it's not tested, it's not taught, even in 1st grade. So, you know, and it was really refreshing to kind of put that as a secondary thing and really look at our long-term goal. Like, what major global issues are we addressing? And that's what we're going to address first. And interestingly, in that process, we've actually hit several standards along the way. Our lesson is full of ELA standards.
Right.
It's a typical ELA lesson. But I think it was really wonderful to have that long-term goal first. It kind of made my shoulders go down rather than being like, we're going to do a lesson on reading comprehension. No, like let's have a broader issue. And I think in the end, the fact that we're working on a much bigger issue is much more interesting to students and sparks more inspiration in them. So it's more of an authentic lesson rather than we're going to walk through a particular set. So I think that's why it was really a wonderful experience.
And just a quick comment to the question just about process versus product, and kind of how this process may be different from the kind of average lesson planning. I think in addition to the product of the lesson plan that was created, there was that coming together of the actual lesson planning groups themselves. So Monica, for instance, you have a school counselor with a woman who was an elementary teacher mentor in her district, so she didn't have a traditional classroom, and then a music teacher. That's not the traditional grouping. And then you're, meeting these people for the first time in Washington, D.C., split them up, here's a goal, give them like an hour or so. You guys, we want to see that.
It was super fast.
And then they presented in front of,
and then we're going to publish it.
Actually,
oh yeah. So that was something. Like, are we coming up with this book? Because there was a book example, right?
Welcome to the fellowship. By the end of the fellowship, you guys will be authors. Get together with these strangers from different contact background and make it happen. Then not only that, they stood in front of these strangers and presented and got feedback in real time. Could have gotten a little bit touchy, but I think that it was a little bit touchy. But I think that process kind of takes us through some of the tension around this work, and I think the fact that we were able to group people come together with this idea of global education also being interdisciplinary. What does that look like when you're able to bridge English with math and also add a global lens to that? So I think this is really the future of education, that we kind of break down these silos and kind of add that unorthodox element to the lesson planning piece.
That's great. Let's hear more from you. Why don't you get up behind the mic, and then I'll come to you. Why don't you start, Mitra, since you're next to the mic? Go ahead. Sure.
Hey, my name is Nora. I'm also a student in International Education Policy Program. And kind of opposite to Charlotte, I came here as an international student and actually taught in public schools as a United Nations Association trainee for like the public schools in Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and it was 8th grade social study. Basically, I was teaching the model United Nations. What I thought interesting is just like comparing to the Asian context is that those kind of lessons could never take place in public schools. It's like unless you go to private schools, because the public schools are so focused on exams and standardized tests. But even in the U.S., from my experience, sometimes it's also what I found is that because the classroom I was teaching was voluntary based, so you see a lot of students who are there are willing to, they already had a awareness to like learn more about different cultures and backgrounds. But sometimes students with like disadvantaged backgrounds, say English second language learners, or like first generation college students, they don't really have that courage or the support. So I'm just curious, in your experience, how do you kind of facilitate or kind of encourage students from less less advantaged background to participate in your class?
Thank you, Nora. While you think about that question, let's get another question. Mitra.
First of all, thank you so much. Kristen, I've talked to you. I'm Mitra Chiaverini. I'm the executive director of World Teach, and to date myself, I actually was here when we started the IEP program with Fernando 20 years ago. So I was the coordinator for the program's coordinator. So as you're speaking, I'm really wondering, and Kristen, this is prompted by what you just said, is that there are millions of teachers that would like to do this or gain global competencies. So I'm wondering, are these teachers unique, or are more people? Like, what's the profile of the American teacher who would be interested in acquiring global competencies? And I ask selfishly because at World Teach, we're just launching a professional development program that's we're sending American teachers to Uganda, Kenya, and Mexico, and giving that sort of exchange over an immersive 4-week program of collaboration. Everything you just said echoes in our program. So I'm just wondering, are you guys unique, or are you part of a movement, a growing, and just so that's it.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Personally, say I don't think we're unique. I think that people just maybe don't know how to get started with it. People are already doing it, and they're just not calling it global ed. They're already doing these types of things, and I think that's pretty evident. And so we were the first cohort through the fellowship that had to apply to get in. And so and there were 400 and something applications, and there's 46 of us.
And the application was extensive.
It was extensive. And so there's 46 of us. So when you think about, like, while we're in the program, there were 400 plus people who applied. So I don't think that we are unique. I think that we sometimes people just need that avenue to get started. I think sometimes people don't know where to go to get resources. And so I think a lot of it is putting it out there because, like I said, I just switched schools. And as soon as I mentioned empatico.org to my principal, he was like, oh, this sounds amazing. And then I put it out there to staff, and I'm like, I'm just looking for one person. And I've got a ton of emails back with all these people like, I'm in. Like, what do I need to do? What else can I be doing? And so, then it's like, so I don't think we're unique. I think that people just don't know that things are out there, or they're doing it and they're not calling it global ed. So I think a lot of it is just doing things like this, having these and having it live streamed, because things like this are happening all over the place. And so I think when we're live streaming, we're then opening it up to more people being able to have access to something like this, because I've put it out to everybody back home, and we're 3 hours behind. They're still in school right now, but they'll catch it later when the YouTube video comes out, because they can't, they could stop class, but that's not professional, because they're in the middle of teaching. And so they'll catch it on the back end, those of us from the West Coast. But, so I think it's just having those more opportunities like this, where people are coming together, we're having these global ed conversations, and then we're able to put it into a platform where other people can then join in. Maybe the future looks like the live stream people, there's some kind of computer where they can be able to ask questions and things like that as well. Maybe that's what the future of these types of things look like. But I think as long as we're still being able to collaborate and putting it out there to others, is how we get more people on board.
If anyone out there is watching and you have a question, go on Twitter and copy me at Fernando Riemers, and I'll read the question. You can just do it just now.
Oh, wow.
Other answers.
Wow.
Well, there you go.
Global.
There you go.
Global. I'm sorry.
I just, and I know this is being live streamed, but I want to be transparent too about the impetus of the shift to the open application itself. As I mentioned before, when we first launched the fellowship in 2010, it really was just kind of that week-long field study experience. It wasn't really a deep dive. It was just, a series of school visits, dialogue with teachers, and of course, kind of the typical touristic elements. It was that whetted their appetite for something deeper. So we kind of shifted, and as you guys said, obviously South Africa, or wherever the destination is a big pull, but the application was extensive. Yep. So that's the tier
like
one. Who's willing to go through
and links? You have to do links
guys.
And
no, that it is good feedback, but that is the first tier, is like who's willing to actually put in the work to go through this application. The second thing, and this is more on the back end in terms of how the actual application are reviewed, is how do you create a welcoming environment for someone who has never even stepped foot in this space, but has promise and has the potential to grow. So that has really been the question for something that we try to track on our rubric, is how do you express, hey, I'm a kindergarten teacher from this rural area, I've never been abroad, I'm not a social studies teacher, so I feel like this may not fit my content area, but I'm dedicated to doing the work, I want to join this network. What does that look like in an essay format, or what is the format that you kind of codify that? In terms of the profile, too, all of the fellows are members of the NEA, all of them are public school teachers, and I think that in and of itself creates an interesting dynamic to the question too, just thinking about the children and the students, the profile of the students. This is really broad reaching. Those are questions I still haven't answered in terms of the profile, but what has been interesting to me since we have shifted to the open application is that the interest is there. It's just like, how do you provide the resources? If it's not the fellowship, how can the foundation and other like-minded organizations kind of come together and say, okay, you have an Empatico, which is a free tool. You have a World Teach. You have all these different, State Department programs. How do you kind of curate that and just say what works for you? And global competency really is on a continuum. So maybe doing a year-long PD ending with a field study isn't the right first step, but what is that could maybe lead to something like that?
After meeting everybody, I do feel like everybody has this sort of inspired, we want our students to be explorers. Do you feel that way after meeting everybody? So that is something that we have in common, is that we want our students to be explorers of the world and find out more about the world. We come from different backgrounds, but I do think that's one common link in talking to everybody. After meeting everybody in DC, and then of course going through South Africa together, I just think that that's what everybody had in common, is that we were inspired to show our students the world.
Yeah. And speaking, I just want to respond to the ELL. So I kind of see it as a special ed question as well. So I'm a special education teacher, and I think that it's incredibly important. I'm also one of the people that's on the ELL track for my school district. And I think it's incredibly important to include those students in everything that we do. And it may mean that I'm breaking my kids aside and doing some vocabulary development for them, kind of pre-teaching some of the concepts that I'm going to be doing in the whole group. So when they attend the whole group sessions, that they have a little bit more meaning of it. Because I think when we look at even the statistics around kind of vocabulary development for our ELLs and our special needs students, we don't do the best job exposing them to lots of vocabulary and concepts. Because we're so focused on what you were talking about, standardized testing and make sure they're going to do well on those tests. But I think that it's just incredible. It's very important to make sure that those kiddos are involved in that, and they're participating in the best that they can, and the most that they can. So it's a meaningful experience for them. Because you just never know that. I've always found the SDGs to be incredibly inspiring for students, because you just never know in second or third grade one of those SDGs is going to be really inspiring for a kiddo. You know, like for some reason, civil rights just really responds to them in second grade, and they're going to hear that over and over again. And that's going to be a path that they may or may not have had exposure to, or maybe even seen as an option in their community. So that's one of the reasons why I think SDGs are incredibly important.
The UN Sustainable Goals, that's a wonderful tool. Because if you look into their website, there's so many lessons that can pop up for each of the goals. And it could be, and it's so full of data. Math teachers could use it, definitely social studies teachers, and all of the topics in there are, I think any child can relate to it. Like, we talked about water for 30 minutes, so it's wonderful. So that's a good lesson. That's a good resource to have.
And I think when you have students coming from diverse backgrounds, that's like, oh, do you know what I mean? Because you have global ed sitting right in your classroom. Like my school that I just came from, there were 22 different languages spoken. Like imagine that. All of this stuff aligns. And so you can easily pull those things into your classroom and get those students engaged with whatever you're talking about. So we're talking about water here. So how does that work where you're from? How does this work with your families? How do you do this? And you're building those relationships at the same time. And I think when you're building those relationships with those students, then they are going to be more invested and they're going to be more willing to participate. But it's like, to me, that would be like, oh my gosh, I have all these kids from everywhere. Like, yes. Do you know what I mean? Because it helps solidify the importance of this work, especially when I think about Las Vegas, like we've got everybody, you know? And so, and I think it makes this work that much more important. And even going to my new school that's not as diverse, but it still makes the work that much more important because they don't see it as often. And so they need to be exposed to the global ed, so that because they're going to come across these people potentially in the future, and they're going to need to know how to interact and how to work together.
In my ESL class right now, so we're taking the UN Sustainable Goals one goal at a time. And each of my students, so these are sixth grade ESL students, each of them are taking each goal, and they have to explain it, and they have to come up with a project that they could start with at our school, and then a project idea for the world. And
That's wonderful. What grade is that?
Sixth grade.
That's fantastic.
Yes, so they have to do a presentation about each goal, and so they have to explain it. They got to give me facts. They gotta, And so then they have to tell me what idea can we start off with at our school. And then what's your idea for the world?
That's awesome. Let's get 2 more questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm in the International Education Policy Program. And my teaching experience is mostly in schools where the students didn't have much prior exposure to travel opportunities or even to knowledge of other communities. So I'm wondering, for those of you who have had students with that prior knowledge or that prior exposure, how did you incorporate their understanding into your lessons? And then for those of you who had students who didn't have that exposure, what aha moments did you see as you were teaching these lessons?
That's great.
Thanks.
Do we have a second question while you think about that one? Yes, Aditi. Tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Aditi. I'm also in the International Education Policy Program. My question is more around the process and the underlying principles that formed this collaboration. So what are some of the basic principles, and how did the process of teacher collaboration look like? And for the teachers, I'm assuming that you collaborated across different states. So what challenges did you encounter, and what are the factors that sort of enabled this collaboration to continue for many months?
And I think we can take a third question before we answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. My name is Kajal. I'm also a student in international education policy. So for the past 3 years, I've been working with universities, U.S. universities, to develop their study abroad center in China, and also recruiting students, college students, to study abroad. So my question is that how can we really expand global education outside of classroom? How can we take all these toolkits of these 12 lessons outside of the classroom? For example, if there's any practices or like after-school programs, like family practice that can work cohesively with the education, like in the classroom, that can better prepare students for this global environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to address any or all of these 3 questions?
Well,
Go ahead.
I'll speak to the experience of kids traveling and not traveling. So in my classroom and within the community that I teach, a lot of kids don't have a lot of travel experience. So when I all of a sudden just one afternoon started talking about South Africa, you know, all of a sudden it became all about Lion King. And I was like, well, okay, kids, first of all, Lion King didn't happen in South Africa. And we kind of had to break away from, you know, there aren't lions walking in the streets and things like that. And that experience that I had was shared by the other teachers that did the lesson. And so what we ended up thinking was that we really needed to kind of front load our lesson with a little bit more information about South Africa. So when they walked into the kind of country mouse, city mouse part of the lesson, that they would be able to bring a little bit more information to it. But I think the global education piece is really all about that, like bringing in a lot more background information into what you're teaching. So if you're teaching a novel, like what was the author's purpose? Like why did the person do that? And does it have global significance? Or when you read a particular read aloud story, show your maps and talk about that. So kids are kind of continually bringing in information. And first graders in general, and really elementary kids in general, are incredibly curious about this kind of stuff. They're just sponges to it. So I think that would be the way that
I like exposing my students to what's local in our community also. So I teach science, but I also teach, and I also teach ESL. I also teach theater, and so yes,
she does it all.
I like taking them to the local community theater, and that exposes them to their direct community, and then from there, then we can start expanding. For my science class, this is one of my students' favorite activities, where when we study about the weather, they can choose any country in the world, and they become the meteorologist of that country, of that city. And they love that. So they adopt a city. So they map the weather of that particular city all week, and then they report it. Like, in Paris, it is 74 degrees, but it feels like, and so they just feel like so global. And so I do feel like we expose them to what they're curious about, and they're curious about other countries. And so our librarian and I, we won a grant, and so what we decided to do with the money was we brought world festivals to our school.
Nice.
And we started off in South Africa so that Ms. Rogers can talk about South Africa. And so we talked about this. There in September, there's this whale festival in South Africa, and we talked about the environment. So that became an entry to talk about the environment, and they made environmental posters. And so I do feel like I have to meet them where they're interested. So they're interested in learning about other countries. And so then we start with that.
And I think when we're talking to address about how do we get this outside of the schools, I think it's all about building those partnerships and relationships. And I think the NEA Foundation is amazing at that, bringing on finding and places we go, and they've got these connections already at schools, and they've got these connections with other partnerships. And so I think it's building those partnerships and figuring out what's in your community already and how you can partner with them and say, hey, look, we've got this global education. This is the future, because it is. You know what I mean? We're becoming more global every day. And so I think it's building those partnerships and those relationships with the community centers or the after school programs and things like that. And whether it's like, I mean, personally, I would totally go and volunteer my time and go teach some of this and do these activities and do things with those students in after school programs. So it's finding those people who are willing to do the work, even if they know they're not going to get paid. Pay can come or it may not can come. Do you know what I mean? But if pay is not an option, you got to find people who are willing to volunteer their time to do this work. For those of you who are sitting in here, you all now are connectors to this work, and so now the more that you know, and you're going out and building those connections. And so I think a lot of it is us figuring out in school settings, how do we know some of those partnerships, and some maybe we don't, but figuring out who those partnerships are and who are the best people to talk to get those things going in the outside community. And I think you can kind of spread it like that, or maybe it's us teaching those people to go back and teach the students, however it works best in each community.
Yeah. I'd like to go back to this term of teacher leadership, because really I think that's another big thing with the fellowship. And I say that, in conjunction with the question about how do we kind of raise it up outside of the classroom. I think it's possible for teachers as professionals to have their feet situated in the classroom, but still maintain those connections with, community. And I think, and this may be a soapbox moment, to the extent that we can equip teachers to understand themselves as the true professionals that they are, and, the curators of that expertise. And so use that as a navigating chip when you are in communication with kind of the non-traditional kind of education stakeholders. You are an important bridge between school and community. So what does it look like if you leverage that? And I think the foundation's work is really trying to figure out how we can situate and also be a bridge, so a middleman of the middleman, to connect teachers and put them in these spaces. So I think that's another challenge that we have to face as well. Teachers understanding themselves as leaders, but also still being in schools, but still maintaining that bridge to community in this work.
Let me ask two related questions, if I may. You have all talked about being inspired by thinking about the SDGs, finding exciting to work with these ambitious goals and seeing your kids excited. You've talked about the pleasure of working with colleagues and the challenge of working with colleagues, the excitement of doing this work together. Why isn't this the normal life for a teacher? I mean, why isn't this the work as opposed to the experience supported by that? What are the barriers? What are the obstacles? What would it take to construct the work in a way that made it possible for teachers and students to be excited about real important problems in the world, to be learning on behalf of those things, to be collaborating with colleagues? And then the second related question is, why should we make a case for global education when there are so many needs in so many different communities, I mean, assuming that whatever conditions you present are necessary to support that are going to cost dollars. Why should we allocate dollars to building those conditions to teach global when there are many, many basic needs, right? Kids who don't learn how to read, kids who don't have early childhood, and so on.
I think teachers are faced with so many responsibilities, and that's the main barrier. And I think maybe some just don't understand that this global ed can be integrated into anything. But I think primarily there's so much that we have to do.
And I think people don't realize that it's easily incorporated.
Right. I think
so I think they think of it as another thing instead of something that can be incorporated in, because just as Michael said, this lesson that they're doing with their kids, well, it's hitting so many standards, and it's a mindset shift of thinking, oh, well, I always, for the last 20 years, I've taught this same book to hit these same standards, so why not switch that book up to a book with some characters from another country, or something simple that you can do that adds a little bit more global ed conversation in, but still is hitting the standards. So I think sometimes it's like we're so focused on where there's a test, I got to teach to the test. My kids have to pass these standards. My kids have to do this. My kids have to do that. And we can still, and so it sounds overwhelming when you're like global ed, but it's really starting small. I think sometimes we as educators are like, I want to do it all. And so we overwhelm ourselves because we want to do it all. And it's not necessarily about doing it all at once. It's starting small. So we got to take baby steps. Yes.
It's not a separate thing.
It's not. And so we just switch our mindsets and we start small and we pull up a map every time we read a book, or we switch out the book that we're reading. You know, a few of the fellows have already taken pictures and incorporated the pictures from our trip into things that they're doing in lessons. So it's just those small things, I think. But our minds always go big. You know, teachers are go big or go home, you know. And so I think that's what gets...
Or like you said, we think it's a separate program. It's a program. But really, like, for example, I teach earth science. There's an opportunity to talk about world issues every day.
Every day.
So it can be integrated with whatever anybody's doing.
Yeah.
And I won't get on my soapbox.
There's only a few more minutes.
I know. It's only but I do think that a major barrier of global education is really this kind of focus that we have on teaching to tests. You know, if it's not, and I think I said it earlier, is if it's not tested, it's not taught. So global education may not necessarily be in the standards yet. That's something to aspire for.
Is that pressure maybe more in the elementary school? I don't know. Is it?
I see it all the way up.
Oh, okay.
Teaching to the test, at least in my community.
Okay.
Some form of a test, because there's APs and there's, you know, it just looks a little different.
So that's really a focus. Like, I'm very lucky to come from a school district where I have a superintendent that has a lot of buy-in to global education, and it's, you know, in our mission statement, it's in our portrait of the graduate. But when you actually look at the activities that happen at our staff meetings and our professional development, it's not really global ed that we're talking about. It's about how we can have these students do better on tests and how to do better in reading, writing, and math. And my feeling is that it's really kind of short-sighted. And it's not very inspirational teaching that we're doing. I don't think kiddos wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to go to school and learn how to be a proficient writer so I can do well on the MCAS testing. That's really not that inspiring for most students. But I think if we kind of move that and say, have a more long-term view where students are working towards particular world activities, I think that's much more inspiring. I always say that I would rather shape students to be kind of motivated, inspired go-getters that do well on standardized tests rather than apathetic learners who do amazing on standardized tests. And I think that's really a conversation as educators that we need to have is, what's the purpose of what we do every single day? Are we really inspiring learners to do bigger things in the world and with their lives or in their communities? Or are we really teaching kids to be really good test takers? And so, and I know it varies in different communities, but it's just a question that we need to keep in the back of our minds.
Great question. I think we have time for 2 more questions from you before I turn over to our speakers and ask them to make some closing remarks. I'm giving you a heads up so you can start organizing your thoughts. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm doing IEP here. I've taught for 5 years in London.
Speak into the mic a little bit, Hannah.
Sorry, I'm too short for this. I'm Hannah. I'm studying IEP here. I've been teaching for 5 years in London and in refugee communities in Greece on the islands. I see the value of these lessons hugely, and it's an amazing project. I just wonder, how do you foresee kind of getting these lessons out there? I know kind of the world's largest lessons is an amazing project, kind of based on the sustainable goals as well. And I've seen that used in schools and refugee camps in Greece to create lessons. And I think that's an amazing thing to see that's happening. Have you thought of doing a digital platform for this? And how do you think you can, now that you've got this great project, where can it go?
Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rain from also the same program in International Education Policy, and I really appreciate that you are here to talk about your passion on the SDGs education, because part of my internship at UN Sustainable Development Solution Network, Global Schools Program, we actually try to really come up with these kind of specific lesson plans in order to disseminate to schools globally. So I have a question about like how feasible it can be to actually deliver such specific lesson plans to local schools, because not every teacher is prepared or even knowledgeable about the SDGs and sustainable development. So how do you strategize in terms of scaling up of spreading this kind of specific lesson plans?
Thank you.
Related questions.
Hannah, you want to start?
How do we spread it? I mean, against a platform like this, I am giving it to a lot of people I know. So, like, they get the lessons, and I talk about it, and I make sure that it's something that they can do in their classrooms. So. That's how I tell everybody about it. That I've told so many people that, look, I've got a book, and here it is, and I wrote the lesson. And so I started off with my school. So I said, look, we're going to do the 7th grade lesson, and it was a hit.
So take the first step, is what you said.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
Just going back to the idea of, I guess, digital and dissemination, how to spread this out. So going back to kind of how this book is situated in the larger fellowship in terms of the timeline, they've been posting previously on sites like Better Lesson, Participate, formerly VIF, also on sites like Curriki. And really what we found ourselves doing is that it was very kind of disparate and kind of a drop in the bucket here. You know, we have a collection of maybe like 5 lesson plans over there. So trying to maybe create some type of a clearinghouse is the word we like to use a lot of times, and just pull these things kind of like a one-stop shop, because like you said, teachers have a lot on their plates. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that you could create something digital, and I'm just speaking this into existence, it may exist already unbeknownst to me, but just something is like, okay, I'm a 1st grade teacher. I want to get started with this, maybe something that's a beginner, medium, you know, kind of so on and so forth, so that it's kind of steering them in the right direction and just having it be public facing. Mm-hmm. So I think this book is really our first thing in print. So I'm interested in seeing like how teachers are able to use it versus something digital, maybe toying around with different types of binding and stuff, just really hearing from the teachers in terms of what works best for them.
And I also think, to go back to your question, I think a lot of this is just a starting point, right? And so we've even talked a lot about so I have a 3rd grade lesson that works in a 6th grade classroom. Do you know what I mean? And if you look at the 3rd grade lesson and you're like, I can't find this book, or maybe our school can't afford to buy this book, then maybe there's already a book at your school somewhere that deals with water, or in your department or wherever you are that deals with water that you can pull. So we give you a sample of a book, but that doesn't mean that that's the only book out there that would work with the lesson. And so I think when we're talking about a lack of resources or things like that, I know for us, we were taking that into consideration when we wrote our lesson. We were kind of like, let's look for all online stuff. What can we do that we can give a link and teachers can just go there and they can go online, and you just need access to internet, which we know for most schools have. And so it became and I think a lot of other groups, when they were doing that, they were conscious of that as well. We didn't want it to be something where you had to go out and buy a lot of extra stuff. So hopefully it was like, we have this book and you can find it on YouTube. So the author's reading it or somebody's posted it or whatever the case may be. And you can go onto this link and it's all online resources, things that you can take and you can use so that you don't have to go out and try to look for a ton of extra stuff to be able to do the lesson. You can take what's in here and tweak it to make it your own. And if your kids are like, all right, we got this one book and it didn't really work out well, we got to reteach, because that happens a lot in education. You know what I mean? Then there's, a quick Google search or something like that will find you an array of other books, I think, for a lot of these lessons that you can also use. And so I think it's, these lessons in here are just a starting point. And I think that they're great to be able to take, and you can say, you know what, this worked well, or we need to do another lesson, so I can reteach the same lesson with a different book. I can try this other website, things of that nature. So I think a lot of us kept that in mind with a lot of these lessons, to be able to take them and not have to have any additional resources. We tried to kind of pull from what was already out there.
Yeah, I think just getting the information out there, I think this book and some of Professor Reamer's previous books are really, these are not expensive books. They're pretty much free if you get them on the Kindle. And I think doing that kind of work in other groups like World Teach, doing those kind of lesson plans and putting them out freely, I think that's really an important thing to do, that we share it. But it also kind of, it catches the eye of book publishers and curriculum developers. And it can potentially follow the same trajectory that multicultural literature had. Like I remember in 1991, when I first started teaching, that it was really hard for me to find books that had kind of the faces of my children represented in the books. It was a very difficult thing. I'd have to come to a bookstore here in Harvard Square here, and it's gone out of business, but I think it's because the multicultural literature piece has really taken on, and book publishers are now, it's almost a requirement. So it would be really wonderful that maybe in 5, 10, 20 years, that book publishers and curriculum developers and the Common Core curriculum really reflects a global perspective, and then everything will trickle down from there. So that's kind of a long term, but right now I think we're really at, I would say we're a little bit above a grassroots level at this point, but I think just people sharing and saying that they're interested and saying, oh, I did teach this, and people just talking about it in their professional networks. And I think that just builds.
That's great. Would any of you like to say a few words in closing?
This has been such an empowering experience, and really, just when I thought it was, done, that we're done, you guys have moved on to the next class. I get this wonderful opportunity to come here to Harvard. I mean, it's a dream. So it's to talk about what I do and what we've done. It's been an honor. So thank you. Thank you.
I think that I would say just start, don't have it be such a big thing and so overwhelming. Just start small with Global Ed and then build from there. It's easily incorporated into everything that we are doing, and whether we are in the classroom doing, we're gen ed teachers or we're special ed teachers, we're GATE teachers, we're foreign language teachers, we're school counselors, whatever the case may be, like this is work that all of us can do in some capacity. So we just have to figure out what the capacity is that meets the needs of our roles and start there. There's all of us here as resources now. There's 46 of us as resources. Feel free to, I guess, catch us at the reception if you have any other questions that you didn't things to ask. We have some fellows over there who will answer some questions as well. We will totally put them on the spot. But yeah, I would just say, start small, incorporate it where you can incorporate it in, but it's definitely, I think, a mindset shift that we all need to start making.
You can talk about the world anytime.
Yes.
I would say definitely apply to the program.
Yes. Join us.
Join us. Join us. To be honest, I think I started by saying I work in a small town, and I would never have been able to have access to the level of professional development that I did through this program. This book was actually just one part of our program, and a lot of the webinars that we had were by leaders in the field, writers,
experts,
movers and shakers, experts. So it was something that I would never get in my regular professional development. So it's really kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity.
For sure.
I think, it's just amazing.
I think if I could sum up the fellowship this evening and any of my interactions with the fellows, it would just be fulfilled. And I say that to say, when I'm sitting at my desk doing spreadsheets, sending out those lovely emails.
I love them.
With, the number.
I skip every until I get to you.
Yeah, there's a lot of signs between, they're not going to look at the whole email, so the important stuff floats to the top. Deadlines have to be read, so on and so forth. But when I'm sending out these very kind of clerical administrative things, it's easy for those things. And I think the same thing applies to many jobs. You kind of lose sight of the why, you lose sight of the purpose. So whenever, I see someone on Facebook say, hey, I Skyped with a classroom in Nigeria. We had this great connection. It's daily, it's constant reminders of the why of this work. And I think you guys also give a face to the movement, because I think it's very easy for, the Sustainable Development Goals are great, don't get me wrong, but they're only as good as the people enacting them. And I think just to go back to the take action piece, so I thank you for your work. I thank you for everyone in this audience, because I think you're all a part of this larger puzzle, and one day hopefully we'll figure it out.
Well, Monica, Hannah, Michael, thank you so much for the work that you do every day. Not only do you touch eternity, you shape it. And we live complicated times that make your work ever more critical, more crucial. So thank you for that. Thank you, Kristen, for your wonderful leadership of this project, and Robert. And thank you to the NEA Foundation for supporting this amazing Global Fellows Program, and for the privilege of having provided me the opportunity to be a witness to this good work. And now thank you, all of you, for coming. The NEA Foundation is inviting you all to a reception just outside, where we can continue the conversation in a more informal setting, and you can get these teachers and their fellow fellows to sign copies of the books for you. Thank you all for coming. Yeah.